What is up, guys? Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to give you the first installment of a series that I'm going to be doing on biographies of influential photographers. I came up with the idea for this series because I discovered Bailey Sarian's series of true crime stories, and I don't even think that I like the true crime aspect of it. I just like the story aspect of it, getting the backstory and then the events and all of that. And I figured that it might be really interesting to do something similar, but for photographers instead. And so I looked up influential photographers, and that's when I realized that influential photographers is kind of a loaded term because most of the search results come back with just influential white male photographers and, maybe one or two influential white female photographers. And so I really wanted to feature some photographers from around the world who don't make it onto these lists, but whose work is still influential nonetheless. Like the guy who I'm showing you today, Shomei Tomatsu. If you look at his work, you cannot tell me that is not influential. You cannot. But you won't find him on any list of influential photographers. I actually had to Google like a couple different country names, influential photographers, in order to build my list of photographers who weren't old white men. I don't know how often I'm going to be putting out new videos in this series. I've got a whole series on sexism in photography coming up for the rest of March for International Women's Day and stuff like that. So this biography series is going to be on hold until the end of March, but I'm hoping to do at least one biography series video a month. I think that's going to be a good number. The photographer who I'm talking about today is somebody who I was once I discovered his photography, I just really wanted to talk about him because honestly, it is extremely inspiring. I've tried to challenge myself to go out and replicate his style a few times, and it's just impossible. He's such a unique view on the world, and you'll see that in a second. Actually, I'll play some of his photos beside me while I'm talking about this. So I'm probably going to butcher his name a little bit. The EI letter combination at the end of his name has a different sound in English than it has in Japanese. And I'm also going to be putting emphasis on probably the wrong syllables in his name, just because I'm going to anglicize his name. So I'm going to be calling him Shomei Tomatsu, which you can look up how that's pronounced in Japanese, but I would butcher if I tried, so I'm not going to. So without further ado, I'm just gonna get into it. Shomei Tomatsu was born in 1930 in Nagoya. He was born into the Japanese Empire, which at the time before World War II was a very expansionist and oftentimes aggressive empire, and very nationalist, as empires are. And in 1930 to 1932, so he's 2 years old at this point, Japan experiences the worst economic downturn in modern history, which the entire rest of the world did as well, or most of the world. It was called the Great Depression. So essentially, Shomei was born into a expansionist empire, hit by a Great Depression, and then entered a war before he was even a teenager, which, if you think about it, it would have a very profound and unique impact on a person's psyche. During the war, he was recruited into the war effort and went to work at a steel factory. He underwent incessant conditioning to instill fear and hatred towards the British and Americans, which obviously was a very common practice throughout the world during this time. Not specifically towards British and Americans, but just fear of the enemy and rationalization of the war. Oh, I should make a quick disclaimer. I'm going to be reading out some passages. I've got my script right behind the camera. I'm going to be reading out some passages from Wikipedia just because they're phrased really well, or some of them are direct quotes and stuff like that. I've also got a list of sources at the bottom of this video if you want to check them out. Definitely would recommend checking some of them out. Okay, that was my disclaimer. So after the war, for a 6-year period, the American forces occupied Japanese cities, and Japan was completely under American occupation. So this guy who was born into an empire, faced a depression, faced a war, is now having his country occupied by a completely foreign culture in a completely foreign country. Japan and America at that time had polar opposite cultures, about as different as they could have been. And during this time, these formative years in Shomei Tomatsu's life, he's about 15, 16, they are then coming together in a very forced and dramatic and painful way after the extreme devastation that was left by the war. I'm giving you this backstory so you can kind of get an idea of what went into crafting the psyche of this artist, who then went on to produce some very prolific and very beautiful and very unprecedented and original artworks. So as the Americans occupied Japanese cities in this post-war period, Shomei was interacting with them on a somewhat daily basis, as were many Japanese interacting with many American soldiers. And he began to kind of see a disconnect between the demons that he had been fearing for the last 6 years of the war and the people who were now living in the city and acting like regular people. And I can imagine that that would be pretty difficult to reconcile, especially in the wake of something as horrible as the atomic bomb. How can these people who are capable of just mass murder on such an unprecedented scale then come and drink at a bar and make jokes and miss their wives and, just act like regular people. And so that kind of irreconcilable almost conflict between those two notions of what an American is really appears in his photographic work. I take it that these kind of dissonant feelings about the enemy, who is now having to be incorporated as an ally, or at least as not an enemy anymore, I take it these feelings were quite common across the globe in this post-war period and probably really marked the sentiment of the last half of the 1940s and early part of the 1950s globally. There's a lot of bad blood left over in this post-war period, and there is a lot of really fascinating, really culturally significant art that came out of this period, and I think Shomei Tomatsu's work really exemplifies that. So the war ended when Shomei was 15, and shortly after that he went to university. He attended the Aichi University, and there is where he really developed a love for photography. It said that he embraced photography throughout his years at university. He entered many monthly photography contests, and he had his work shown in many of them, so he was really kind of picking up steam as an artist in this period. He actually didn't start photographing until just after the American occupation ended, but his photographs were still very much influenced by this period, as was Japan. So the American occupation had ended, but the influence of the American occupation had not and would never end. The cultures were already very much interconnected in a way. I don't want to say integrated because they weren't, but there was lots of influence of American culture on Japan and encroaching influence of Japanese culture in America. Also, just because the occupation had officially ended didn't mean that there was no more Americans living in Japan. A lot of the American soldiers stayed behind, and there were still many American military bases dotted throughout the country. So if you kind of think about Shomei's life so far, he has never really had a solid grounding for the world and what the baseline of the world that he inhabits should look like. Because, he was born into an empire, experienced a depression, went through a war, entered American occupation, and is now in this kind of unprecedented state where the Americans are gone, but their impact is still very much felt throughout Japan. And the entire world is now learning to cope with what had just happened and overcome it, but also heal from it. The conditions of his life, at this point he's 20, right? He's pretty young still. The conditions of his life were so radical and so changing, and it was just this roller coaster of, horrible, horrible things. And then now this bizarre period in the post-war. Circumstances of his life were unprecedented. So of course his work is going to be entirely unique and unprecedented because it's not drawing from anything that an artist has drawn from before. If you grow up in some pastoral place in America, okay, well, lots of artists have drawn from that because lots of people have experienced it. But his life was something that was very unique to this time period and this place, and he was one of the foundational Japanese photographers at this time. So you won't even see other works like his coming out of Japan, because photography was a relatively new art form. It hadn't really been crafted into a subjective art form at this point. It was mostly for documentary purposes. So he was one of the first photographers in Japan or around the world to really use it as a subjective art to express something about what he was feeling and about his viewpoint on the world. He's also got a lot of very interesting writings, and this is a bit of a tangent, but I would really encourage you to go and read some of the writings or even just the titles of his photographs, because they say a lot more about the situation and just give you so much more to think about. He's a very fascinating person. One thing that's super, super interesting about his photography is that he is an author, not just of words, but an author in the photograph, and the way that he authors the world that he's depicting is extremely unique. And definitely, you can see, I've been showing the photos, and you can see that they're all just so unique and so different, and they say so much about that time period. Okay, so back to his life and career. So he graduated university in 1954 and joined the Awanami Photography Library. He participated in photography exhibits throughout the 1950s, and towards the end of the 1950s, he began photographing military bases, and that was a project that would span over 10 years of his career and really kind of helped him make a name for himself as an influential photographer. His work became really prolific in the 1960s. He engaged with many prominent Japanese photography magazines. He had many publications. There's a lot of work of his that's been documented from this time. In the early 1960s, he published images of U.S. military bases in Asahi Camera and in Camera Mainichi. and his series Home in photo art. So he has a lot of publications at this point. He was also beginning to develop a highly expressionistic form of image taking. Like I said, that's extremely unique to his own experience as an artist. He was no longer merely documenting events at this point. He was starting to author them through his own unique perspective. Is really genius, really genius stuff. His work was actually criticized at this point for being too artistic. Imagine. There was a perception of photography as a documentary art, and it was meant to capture events as they are. As we've said, Tomatsu had a very unique way of authoring his photographs, so he would actually disagree with the criticism that his art was too artistic. He said he had, quote, never discarded factual fidelity, but that to avoid the sclerosis of photography, it was important to cast out the evil spirit of reportage. So basically, to sum that up, it's like to avoid your photography going stale or going, ossified, you really have to focus on more than just documenting the events, more than just, taking a picture of, okay, this guy's standing on the street corner this day, I'm just going to take a picture of it. And that's something that we really need to draw from as modern photographers as well, is that you're not just documenting events. You got to think, what is this photo about, and what am I trying to say with it? And he was one of the first photographers to actually do that. Some of his most influential works, in my opinion, came in the 1960s when he was commissioned by the Japan Conference for Banning the Atomic Bomb to go and photograph bomb victims in Nagasaki. So at this point, the atomic bomb had not been banned yet, and everybody's talking about, around the world, talking about we need to prevent nuclear war from ever happening again, because if this happens on a large scale, our planet is going to be done, and we're all going to die. And obviously the horror of what had happened in Nagasaki, I think you see interviews with American soldiers who dropped the bomb and they had no idea that was what they were going to be doing. There is this growing global movement to make sure that another atomic bomb will never be dropped. So as part of this kind of initiative to show the devastation of the bomb, because I feel like Japan was very familiar with how devastating this bomb was, but the rest of the world just didn't understand. And I feel like still a lot of people just don't understand what it actually does to not just the city, but the entire country around it. Maybe this is a bit of a tangent, but I actually have been to Hiroshima and got to visit the Hiroshima Museum. And so that was very much instilled in me, was how horrifying this actually is. And it is the most horrifying thing maybe that's ever happened on the planet. And so this photographer was able to go and document the aftermath of this bomb that is hopefully never going to be dropped again. So hopefully no other photographer ever will have an opportunity to photograph bomb victims 20 years after a bomb is dropped, because we will never have another bomb dropped. But Shomei Tomatsu was able to photograph bomb victims, and his images of them are, completely haunting, because these people have been devastated by this nuclear power that, the photos I think speak for themselves. You really see the lasting impact of that devastation in the microscopic ways of how it impacts each individual person, and not just the big crater in the city, but you're seeing the effects of it on a human body. He also photographed some objects that were left over after the bomb, and there's this one image that is just so haunting, because at first, what does it look like? It looks like some kind of dog thing, a hot dog maybe, and it's a glass bottle that was so burnt and twisted by the atomic bomb that it is not only unrecognizable in shape, but it's unrecognizable just in form. It looks like some alien creature. And that was how the bomb left 2 entire cities, was just looking like this. And it's horrifying to think about. So he was able to photograph the bomb victims, and he had an opportunity to speak to them as well. And he said that initially photographing them was very difficult because their appearances were obviously very jarring. But his work on this project had him named as the Photographer of the Year by the Japan Photo Critics Association, and his work here was also published in a book called Hiroshima, Nagasaki, 1961, which is an extremely influential book. And this book is, I am so insulted. I am so upset that this man did not make it onto any lists, no lists on Google of influential photographers, even though he published this book, which is full of photos that are entirely unique to this devastating period in human history, and he was able to document it, and he doesn't count as influential. I can't. But the images that he published in this book, and in all of his books really, are absolutely fascinating and sobering and profound. So, in 1967, his publisher folded, so they went out of business, and Tomatsu followed this by creating his own publishing company, Shaken. He published several photo books through this company, including Nippon, which is the Japanese word for Japan. Yes, Japan doesn't call themselves Japan. That was in 1967. He published Assalamu Alaikum in 1968. I might have pronounced that wrong. And O Shinjuku in 1969. Tomatsu made various efforts to promote photography throughout Japan. So this was kind of like later on in his career, he realized that this photographic art really had a future in Japan and really like dedicated himself to spreading it and helping others to also become photographers and document the events in Japan. He worked as a professor at the Tama Art Academy in 1965 and Tokyo Sokai University from 1966 to 1973. These positions also led to his role as an exhibition organizer for the influential show A Century in Photography, a historical exhibition of photographic expression by the Japanese, which was part of an initiative by the Japan Professional Photographers Society to construct a history of Japanese photography for the first time. In 1969, he's being employed by Asahi Camera, and he travels to Okinawa for the first time. There, he captured images for his book Okinawa, 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 which critiqued the American Air Force. He also visited Okinawa 3 more times before moving to Naha, which is the capital city, in 1972. His images from Okinawa were showcased in his prize-winning book Pencil of the Sun, that was in 1975, which represented a shift away from his capturing of military bases and American soldiers throughout the 1960s. He claims that it was Okinawa's beautiful landscapes that inspired him to adopt color photography and work color photography into his artwork a little bit. And a side note, like, when I was looking for his color photography, I didn't believe that these were taken by him because they are so different from his black and white photography. Like, it looks like it's taken by 2 different people. It's wild. It's this guy. Very, very, very talented and very, very, very diverse art in his collection. He returned to Tokyo in 1974, where he continued to nurture the photography community in Japan. His efforts, in concert with other influential Japanese photographers at the time, led to the establishment of photography departments in several major Japanese museums, including the Tokyo Museum of Modern Art. Also in 1974, Tomatsu made history once again by participating in his very first major international show at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. This exhibit was called New Japanese Photography, which was the very first showcase of modern Japanese photography outside of Japan. By 1980, he had published 3 more books: The Scarlet Dappled Flower in 1976, The Shining Wing in 1979, and The Kingdom of Mud in 1978. Tomatsu went on to be featured in several more museums and to publish several more books throughout the 1980s. This is like in the later part of his career. He moved to Chiba and roamed the beaches and photographed debris that washed up onto the sandy shores near his home. He titled this set Plastics. So a side note, I've also photographed the debris on the shores of Japan, and they are both fascinating and terrifying, I guess, because there is just such a diverse kind of debris. Like, some of it is glass, some of it is like old pieces of porcelain, some of it is like, you know, little bells and things. Like, it's fascinating to look at. Like, if I was like a magpie, I would be having a field day looking at it, but knowing that it's all trash that exists in the ocean and that is constantly washing up on the shore because there's so much trash in the ocean is a little bit horrifying. And so even back in the 1980s, there was enough trash in the ocean, obviously, to be horrifying to Tomatsu, so he photographed it. Throughout the 90s and the 2000s, he exhibited a series of retrospectives around the world and finally moved to Okinawa permanently, where he died of pneumonia on the 14th of December 2012. So, throughout this video, I have shown you a lot of photos of his, and I'm sure that you would agree that he is a fascinating and influential photographer who is absolutely worth learning about. So I would really encourage you to go on, have a look at some more of his photographs that I wasn't able to show in this video, and just, you know, have a think on it. Style is absolutely unique, unprecedented, and 100% worth study, especially if you are interested yourself in the photographic arts. Some of the things that I noticed about his photographs is that he's got a lot of pictures of people smoking or exhaling smoke. I'm not going to make any kind of interpretive opinion on that, but it is just an interesting element that seems to be recurring in his photography. Another piece is that he often captures images through things, so he'll have like a tiny hole and just someone's face like looking out of the tiny hole, something like that. Like he works with foreground elements in really interesting ways. There's also certain elements in his photography that you really don't see in pre-war Japanese photography. So pre-war Japanese photography is pretty similar to other forms of pre-war photography around the world. It's in studio, you've got people in costumes. A lot of early photography around the world, Japan included, was very much trying to recreate the style of portraits. So, you know, for a painted portrait, you stand still, you dress up, and the person paints your portrait, and it's in studio. A lot of early photography around the world was basically just a replication of that. And so you can see the really stark departure from, you know, here is an early example of Japanese studio photography to what Shomei Tomatsu was doing just like a few decades later. It is a very radical shift in that art form. So that's super fascinating. Another thing that I noticed in some of his pieces is that there are very obvious throwbacks to iconic Japanese imagery. So here's a great example, this photo versus this painting. And I just think that's really interesting that he's got the same kind of use of positive and negative space and the same sorts of like slopes and things like that, and yet it is a very different image. I also heard a really interesting take, and unfortunately I can't find very many photos that he took of soldiers, but a very interesting take is that he photographs Black American soldiers in a different way than he photographs white American soldiers, showing that he really understands that Black American soldiers are treated much differently and have a much different role in American society than the white American soldiers. I think that is a pretty interesting thing to notice, and I really wish that I could find more of his photographs of the soldiers because I'd like to see this comparison or contrast for myself. So to end this video, I just want to leave you with 4 images that have really stuck in my mind the most. So the first one is this one of a geisha smoking a cigarette, because that is just, if there is a representation of American and Japanese culture clashing in a very strange way, it is this photo. The melted bottle photo that I talked about earlier also really, really sticks with me. It is just, it's very haunting, and yeah, sticks with me. Photo to dwell on. The images of the craters, bullet holes, and debris that he took after the war are also photos to dwell on. And finally, this image of a man in a suit standing at a newsstand smoking a cigarette. Again, this image I think just really captures the encroachment of American culture onto Japanese society. I mean, look at it. There's something like really, really, really interesting about this image. I can't quite put it into words, but if you look at it long enough, I'm sure you'll know what I mean. So that's all that I've got for this video. I hope you enjoyed this. I know it's a bit of a longer video, but it is a biography, so I really wanted to do it justice. And I'm gonna be doing one of these, I think, once a month for now, unless you guys really like them, in which case I'll probably do them more often. But I really enjoyed doing the research for this video. I really enjoy this kind of stuff, looking at all the background and things like that, and obviously learning more about, like, how did this photographer, like, his work is so interesting, and like, how did that work come to be, or like, how did the artist that produced that work come to be? So I hope that you guys find that as fascinating as I did. I am going to be looking up some new photographers and doing some new research in the coming weeks, and I will have a new video for you like this next month. In the meantime, I've got some videos coming up on sexism in photography for March, so please give those a watch. I feel like it's a really important topic. I'm going to be talking about a lot of very important things that are near and dear to my heart, as well as to the hearts of the models that I work with, so please give those a watch. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave me a like. It really does help me out. The algorithm just loves it when you like things. And if you'd like to leave a comment letting me know what you thought of this video, maybe suggesting some photographers that I could talk about next, that would be great. You can also subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see some more content like this in the future, and you can hit that bell icon to get notified every single time I post. Thank you so much for watching today. I know it was a bit of a different video, but I had a lot of fun with it, and I will see you next week. Stay sharp, and don't forget to keep shooting. One thing I just wanted to quickly mention that really doesn't seem appropriate with the tone of the video, but my computer autocorrects Shomei Tomatsu to shame tomato. So all of my research notes, like, he's shame or shame tomato.